From FingerLakes1.com and presented by FL1 Radio, I'm Josh Durso, and this is Inside the FLX. Our program today begins in early May. That's when the tech company LiveTiles announced that they would be expanding in Rochester, adding hundreds of jobs and sparking an interesting debate. What qualifies as economic development in the Finger Lakes? It was billed as a win for the region, but some have been critical of the regional divide and overly competitive nature of economic development efforts broadly in New York State. I wrote about that question in a column for the Finger Lakes Times, and 24 hours later, an exchange happened on Twitter that led to this program. Vincent Esposito is the executive director of the Finger Lakes Regional Economic Development Council and serves as regional director for Empire State Development. He's a former Monroe County legislator, a lifelong resident of Monroe County, and our guest this hour. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So let's unpack this a little bit. Let's start broad. Where is the Finger Lakes?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me stipulate the Finger Lakes are very clearly a geographic entity. 11 lakes encompass about 14 counties in central and western New York. The confusion, I think, jumps from the fact that the state categorizes economic development regions around the major metros.
Right.
And in our case, it's really the greater Rochester metropolitan region that is our economic development region. We name it and call it the Finger Lakes, but as I tell everybody, it only has 6 of the 11 Finger Lakes within it.
Right.
So you inherently have confusion when you sort of create these arbitrary lines around metro regions. Central New York is not the greater Syracuse region, it's the central New York region, and the southern tier, and western New York's not the greater Buffalo region. So it's really a confusion in naming that sort of stems from some of the sort of conversations people like you and I will have when it comes to confusion over that. But very clearly we have a wonderful region that encompasses these beautiful lakes, have a lot of assets, and have really several cities, Syracuse, Rochester, Ithaca most notably, that kind of encompass the border of the Finger Lakes. And so when we go about economic development, we try to be regional in nature, and sometimes these invisible lines that the state creates become problematic when we're just trying to be organized. So that's, I think, high level where we're at and why we got to this conversation. But I do want to thank you for having it and for humoring me on Twitter and inviting me to be here to talk about it in a little more detail.
I think it's interesting because a lot of it is probably just misconception about what's happening. You know, it isn't really CNY versus the Finger Lakes or Syracuse versus Rochester or Buffalo, et cetera. Right. But sort of walk us through what the purpose is and then what the approach has been now versus what it was historically prior to the regional sort of setup.
No, it's a great way to jump into this. So when Governor Cuomo came into office in 2011, he brought with him a new economic development approach. Mm-hmm. And I was working in the state for a state legislator at the time. I was in the Monroe County legislature. Yeah. And I'll admit, I didn't quite understand what he was talking about when he was first running and talking about these regional councils. I wasn't sure if he was talking about creating a new state agency or getting rid of Empire State Development, which had become and is known today as the Economic Development Agency for the state. And so I didn't start working for him until a year after he was in office. I came in 2012. And that first year, it sort of, as I saw the regional councils get established, it occurred to me, okay, I get what he's doing. And it boils down to the fact that he believes, I think correctly, that New York State is not one economy. It's not even two economies, which most people would describe it as the downstate New York City metro region and then all of upstate. It's really a series of regional metropolitan economies, whereas there's a lot of similarities between them. There are important distinctions, important strengths you need to build upon, and different opportunities. And so he used these metropolitan regions to create what he calls regional economic development councils, which are in short the main advisory boards to New York State of local stakeholders from business, academia, nonprofit, labor, community organizations to have a say in their own regional future, specifically how New York State invests in opportunities there. So that's how this all came to be. So when the governor came into place, he came into office now 7 years ago and created these, a lot of focal points and investment run through them. Right. And that changed the way the state approaches economic development. It changes the way we talk about economic development. And sometimes it works really well. And sometimes you have these sort of arbitrary dividing lines between regions that have a lot more similarities than differences, and it can cause some confusion and sometimes consternation, which we work through whenever we can. But that's the big picture how this came to be. It was the creation of these 10 micro metropolitan economic development regions and the regional councils to really guide the future for each of them that got us to where we are today, and what we're still doing in New York State. And in many respects, while not perfect, has really changed the nature by which upstate regions in particular feel like they have ownership of what the state is doing to help them grow their economies.
So let's talk about that live tiles, the excitement around that, because that is a big deal. Tech industry, obviously, that matters, especially for a place like Rochester.
Yeah.
Sell that excitement to those who are in Seneca, Wayne, Yates counties who might be saying, well, how is that going to affect me? I understand that there is a blossoming effect that can happen whenever you have a big win like that. But how do you sell that to the folks who live in the more rural places? I've got to think that might be one of the bigger challenges that you guys face.
It is. It no doubt is. And that was there to the point I made, the primary point when we were exchanging in response to your column, was that not every project benefits every part of every region. It doesn't. The point of what we're trying to do is approach economic development regionally and strategically to try to benefit and boost upstate New York, where all across upstate New York we have had, at best, a stagnant economy and population for decades, right? So there is no community in upstate New York that is thriving so much that we can just say we don't need to worry about them, they're doing great. Maybe Saratoga, right? Maybe parts of Ontario County, but there are only places where there's even population growth outside of New York City. So the point isn't that every project that benefits Rochester needs to help Seneca Falls also. It's that we need to help all of them. Now, I would certainly say Rochester being the primary driver for our regional economy, having over 60% of the population and probably even more than that in terms of the total number of job or economic activity, if Rochester grows in prosperity, it's going to benefit the surrounding areas, and in particular the Finger Lakes, which I think are going through sort of a renaissance and an awakening among people outside of here to really see how beautiful this region is, both from a economic and geographic point of view. And I think our wine region is leading in that. And I think that's exciting. But I know, living in Rochester and Monroe County my whole life, the awareness of what the Finger Lakes has to offer, the Finger Lakes proper, what you might call the core of the Finger Lakes, is something that people, I think, maybe had taken for granted or weren't aware of, and I think those things are changing. And so I think as you bring in companies like Alive Tiles, which was founded by Australians, headquartered in New York City, has offices on 3 different continents, and has now been building their biggest headquarters in North America in Rochester, that's going to excite the Rochester economy, and the people who come to that are going to commute maybe from this region, or more likely explore it and become part of the customers for places and businesses along Seneca Falls or along the lakes. And that's sort of the part of the idea when it comes to regional economic development. But that's not all that we're trying to do. We're not just saying let's build Rochester and ignore the outer parts of the region.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that contributes to the idea that it puts Rochester, the Finger Lakes, on the map for other site selectors.
Absolutely.
Right? That's got to be the logic behind it. So how do you continue to sort of build up the entire Finger Lakes while having those sort of major metro areas, or major for us around here, that are obviously going to be a little more appealing to those site selectors as opposed to a Middlesex or a community in rural Ontario County as opposed to Rochester?
Yeah, and the idea here, I didn't get into the strategy, but the idea here is not haphazard. This is actually targeted and strategic. So the regional council exists. I explained how the governor set those up to be the advisory boards in New York State. But not only do they help fund projects or make recommendations for what the state should invest in, they actually create a strategic plan to do this. So the regional council created a strategic plan in 2011, and we updated it and created a new 5-year strategic plan in 2015 called Finger Lakes Forward. This was the plan that said, here are our strengths historically, and here are the things we can build on. This was the plan that helped win the Upstate Revitalization Initiative competition, the $500 million that the state committed to our region and also to Central New York and the Southern Tier over 5 years to implement your vision. So that vision is focused on really 3 primary industries where the state can partner with the local region to grow. Optics, photonics, and imaging is one of the biggest plays in our region. It's, yes, very focused around Rochester, but there's a huge supply chain that is strong in Wayne County, strong in other places. The other middle sort of pillar, and one that is really more important than people realize, maybe not listening to your show or around here, but ag and food is the second pillar of our regional strategic plan. It's incredibly important to our economy. We have one of the largest sort of agricultural regions by itself east of the Mississippi in things especially like dairy and fruit and vegetables and, of course, the wine region. But the food innovation that's happening here is unbelievable, and it's very high-tech. It's really stemmed around the expertise that Cornell has brought to this entire state and is rooted right here in Geneva at the former Ag Experiment Station, now called Cornell Agritech, which was just designated a Center of Excellence by New York State. So that's the type of thing. That Center of Excellence designation happened because the Regional Council strategically prioritized ag and food growth as an opportunity to invest in. And then the third pillar is what we call next generation manufacturing and technology. It's taking advanced manufacturing, but recognizing that's a technology, a whole different world of technology by itself. You also have advanced materials and information technology and software built into that. These are the high growth opportunities for the jobs of the future. And those are based around what we see as three primary sites. One being downtown Rochester, when the Downtown Innovation Zone that was created, and why Live Tiles is here today, and why subsequent to Live Tiles we had a company come from the West Coast called Employee Channel that was an RIT alumni. So these are companies we're going after specifically because downtown Rochester offers the type of places and the type of workers they're looking for at a much cheaper rate than Boston or Silicon Valley. It also identifies and prioritizes Eastman Business Park as an asset that is unlike anything else in the United States in terms of the infrastructure it offers. It's a city within a city that was obviously built just for Kodak, but now hosts over 100 different companies with over 5,500 non-Kodak employees. That's the second site you've probably heard a lot of people focus on. And yes, that's in Rochester, but that's an enormous sort of opportunity to grow manufacturing. And then the third prioritized site in that next-gen manufacturing and technology pillar is the Stamp site, the potential to develop a huge industrial manufacturing site in Genesee County in between Rochester and Buffalo. So that right there in a quick snapshot is the fundamental essence of the Finger Lakes Forward Plan and the areas where we believe we have great strengths in the Finger Lakes region, the greater Rochester region, to grow. Some of those have applicability in the sort of rural parts of the region down in the Finger Lakes or in the Glow counties to the west, which really have nothing to do with the Finger Lakes, but are in the greater Rochester region, therefore get lumped in as the Finger Lakes. You can imagine how they feel in Orleans County when we say Finger Lakes Forward Plan helps them. But that's sort of the focal point, and it's all underlined by the things you need to do for any industry to grow the workforce, to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem that allows people to start and grow companies, and to really leverage and take advantage of our higher education institutions, which are honestly one of our greatest assets and the reason we're able to attract the Live Tiles or really have any kind of the quality of life that we have in this region with the 19 colleges and universities. So that right there is a snapshot of how we approach this. You can see, just hearing me talk, which things might apply to which parts of the region.
Right. Now, I want to break down a couple of the little points there and get your thoughts on just how to best approach. Keeping young people here in the Finger Lakes, especially, it's not as difficult in Rochester or in Monroe County, a little more difficult in Seneca County, Yates County, etc. Your thoughts on what is being done now and what the sort of outlook looks like in terms of that, given the fact that we have some incredible institutions for higher education right in our backyard.
First of all, I'm way more bullish on this than people might think. Yes, we have incredible higher education institutions. We are one of the greatest importers of college students in the world, New York State. We're also like the biggest exporter because we don't keep enough of them here. But you have sort of a generation coming of age that does not or is not saddled with the burdens of people maybe my age or older who still see Rochester and the Finger Lakes for what it used to be. And the greatness that came with being a leader in the big three with what Kodak's and Xerox and Bausch and Lomb built, and have sort of taken a hit seeing those companies erode, even though a lot of those companies have created the technologies that are the companies that exist today.
Right.
You see a younger generation that recognizes the value and the quality and the cost affordability in this region that they can't get other places and are really seizing upon it. And it's really not coincidental, I don't think, to the movement across the country and certainly in upstate New York to reinvest in our downtowns. Whether it's a downtown that is maybe modest like Seneca Falls or Geneva, or maybe to you or others bigger like Rochester, which is still very much a small city. You have pockets of really cool things happening. That's what people are seeking out, is what can they access, what can they experience. And in many cases, they have flexibility with their jobs to be able to do those almost anywhere they want. Not always. We still need to create more job opportunities, and that's why we've prioritized the industries we have, because we think we have expertise in those industries that will attract the people to stay from RIT or to come here from other parts of the state or country even, if they believe that this is the world leader in optics, photonics, and imaging. And so I think that it's a challenge. It's, of course, a challenge when you face an upstate that some people from outside here might think it's been on the decline, or at least, no argue, stagnant for several decades, to say there's a strong future here. But when you start to see some of the cool things that are happening in tech industries, but also in some of the oldest industries imaginable, particularly craft beverage and food, where our region really is rich. And not just economically speaking, but in terms of creativity and opportunity and resources, that there's some exciting things happening. And I think you're starting to see, certainly in Buffalo and Rochester both, sort of rankings and measurement of millennial population growth. We are at the top of the state and the top of the Northeast in many cases. We maybe are behind the curve, places like Pittsburgh that have maybe done this better previous to now, but now we're starting to grow in ways. And I'm hugely bullish because I've seen what they've done in Buffalo with a little focused investment in its downtown. It's happening in Rochester. We're just a little bit behind, but I believe we've turned a corner. And I think you're going to see it in other places in the Finger Lakes too, where people don't just want the New York City experience. Some people will and always will. There is a quality of life you cannot beat in the Rochester and Finger Lakes areas.
Now, one of the aspects of what you were just talking about is the sort of downtown rebirth, or reimagining what downtown is or what it can be. How important is that aspect of it, even in small communities? Geneva, a great example of what can happen when you start putting some energy and effort downtown, and it's in a pace of maybe 10 years. Looks very different. That can be duplicated, but how? How does that sort of get duplicated around the area?
It's downtown revitalization is essential. It is not just an economic strategy, which you see from the Buffalo Billion to the Downtown Revitalization Initiative to the Rock the Riverway Initiative we're doing in the city of Rochester, where the state and government has a rightful huge role to play in repurposing public spaces and creating infrastructure and amenities that people want to be around. That's it's not a given, but that's important. It's also essential to the confidence and belief and emotional response people have to its region. Even if you don't live in the city of Rochester, if you think that downtown Rochester has nothing going for it, that is the core of our region. It's the core of our economy. It's the core of our identity. Whenever I travel, I've never lived in the city of Rochester in my life. I've lived in Fairport, I've lived in Geneseo, lived in Gates, and I've lived in Irondequoit. I'm a suburban kid, but I always identify myself as a Rochesterian. And if you don't have the belief that your city's going in the right direction, it erodes everything else our region is trying to do from a confidence point of view. And that matters. That's why the governor has been so insistent with the Buffalo Billion strategy and turning around what's happening in Buffalo, because he knows Buffalo has its mojo back. It's not just because of the New York State investments. They're hugely important. But it's because the people there believe in their city again and they know they have a future. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy, just like people who say, there's not a job here, I'm getting out of Dodge. It's really what you make of it. And I think, and I'm proud of people like Howard Zemsky, the president and CEO of Empire State Development, and Governor Cuomo for recognizing that revitalization in downtown has a huge ROI. We're doing it more and more because that's a great way for government to play a role in giving people an opportunity to make of what they want with their city. These initiatives are being funded, not only funded, but determined by local groups. When we award Geneva or Batavia the Downtown Revitalization Initiative, it's not the state that determines where that money goes. It's a local planning committee. The Rock the Riverway Initiative in the city of Rochester, which has $50 million associated with it for a first phase, is completely informed by an advisory group. And so it's giving local entities, regional councils, advisory boards for downtown revitalization, the control and the input and the prioritization of where the state should be supporting their future.
Now, I'm genuinely curious, because if you talk to folks who live in the more rural portions of the Finger Lakes, infrastructure is always that first item that they come up with. Yeah. Well, I would open a business, but there's no water, there's no sewer. It's just not going to happen. Where does that part of the effort, or where do you start in battling that? Because you're talking about a very large chunk of geography that doesn't have what many would just consider givens. This
is a huge balancing act, right? And this is where I have conversations with my economic development partners, the county IDA heads, all the time. We have to balance as a society, not as a state government, the investment we put into our geography in a way that is commensurate with where our population is, where our population growth was and is going. Simply can't afford to have every resident in all of upstate New York have every same level of service when it comes to infrastructure, whether it be road, sewer, water, electric, broadband. I live in Irondequoit, one of the most densely populated suburbs in the city of Rochester. I don't have a sewer. I'm on septic. And not that that's what you're talking about, because I know it's not. You're talking about business infrastructure and the opportunity for companies to grow. We constantly have to balance how do we smartly invest, expanding our infrastructure where a business genuinely needs to go someplace that either is a greenfield or has a certain access point or certain market or certain natural resource they need to be with, versus how do we redevelop and infill the incredible amount of infrastructure that we had that isn't being used anymore. Buffalo and Rochester both were created for twice the population than they have because the population spread out. Right. So all of a sudden you had to build out infrastructure, but the population didn't grow and hasn't grown significantly in decades. So you can't just keep building out. So we have to balance the build out and the infrastructure improvements with both maintaining an old network, which is hugely important when you live in the Northeast and you're a couple hundred years old as a state and you have infrastructure that's crumbling, versus the opportunities to expand infrastructure when you have a specific business opportunity. And that's where we find the balance. You know, a lot of people and a lot of economic developers want to keep on building out shovel-ready sites in all parts of our state. Every county wants to have multiple options. We really can't do that unless there's a reason a business needs to be in a particular site, because we can't afford to keep sprawling is the term, smart growth is the term that's more appropriate. We can't ignore smart growth principles and afford to have a level of taxation in this state that isn't going to continue to push people or force people down. So we have to be smarter about it. I think we are being smarter about it in the downtown revitalization initiatives you see, and in the fact that the investments you've seen in parks are primarily directly related to companies also participating and leveraging that investment. It's an incredibly difficult issue when it comes to the totality of expense involved, but it's one that we try to balance, and I would admit we probably don't do it as well as we should. And in particular on the water side, making sure we have environmentally appropriate standards for both wastewater and drinking water is something that is needed everywhere. So it really varies from project to project and area to area.
Now, one area as far as infrastructure is concerned that I find really interesting, you know, being a person who's digital tech driven, broadband expansion. That has to, especially given the tech advanced, live tiles, those sorts of businesses, that has to be the thing that's like, wow, that's where we need to focus our energy. Yeah. Right?
And we are internationally behind the curve, without question. Right. I'll give the governor a lot of credit. He has had a Broadband for All initiative for the last few years, and he is ensuring that everyone in New York State is at least raised to a minimum standard. So everyone in New York State is going to have access to 25 megabit per second broadband internet by the end of, I think it's this year. Yep. Now, that is not a very fast standard anymore. And most in New York State will be at the 100 megabit, which is kind of like basic broadband at this point. So you have, just like in education, you have to make sure everyone is at a certain level, but we need to invest more in our metro regions where we are trying to attract high-tech companies that demand this kind of service and redundant service at that, and utilize the fiber rings that have been put in places like Ontario County and certainly all throughout Monroe County to increase those standards. But certainly when it comes to ensuring that the service providers across New York State meet minimum standards and have raised those at an affordable rate, the governor's done a good job. We will now be at, I think, 99% compliance by the end of this year for that minimal broadband level. It doesn't mean everybody has it, but they have access to it, which is a different thing. And then certainly people who are disadvantaged can also access it at a lower rate, and there's maximum amounts some of the service providers can charge in some areas with that whole Broadband for All initiative.
So I have to ask, just out of curiosity, how do you stay motivated? How do you keep moving forward through something that is not only large and very big in terms of what you're trying to do, but also just in terms of the negativity that sometimes exists when it comes to taxation, economic development, those
staying motivated isn't the problem. The challenge and the need is so great that you got to get geared up for that. And what truly motivates me is in this position and with the people I'm working with, we have the direct opportunity to literally recreate what the greater Rochester region is and what the Finger Lakes region is. And the opportunities are huge. To be the world leader in optics, photonics, and imaging is not a reach. We actually already are. Turning that into something that changes our economy is the challenge. Having a world-class wine region in the Finger Lakes is not a challenge. We have one. Becoming preeminent with Napa is a possibility and something that gets my juices going. To recreate downtown Rochester to be a place where our peers and the people who are younger than us want to be and go and live and interact is really exciting. So you have to see the opportunity and focus on that. You can't ignore the criticism or the negativity because they're there for a reason. And there is nothing that's perfect. The regional council approach is not perfect. It is an improvement to giving regional stakeholders a direct say into what they want their region to be. It's starting to happen. You see companies like Live Tiles coming not by accident. It's because the teamwork involved in the economic development space among the people involved in the regional council, the investments we've made in turning downtown Rochester around, getting younger people a little more interested in staying there, those things are long-term efforts, and you have to keep at them. The difficulty is truly working your way through the frustration, the bureaucracy, the slow incremental progress with it. And that's why the Regional Council Enterprise, in my mind, has actually been the best thing, because it has brought people together to give them at least a shared vision for our region. It may not fit every part of our region. Everybody may not ascribe to every part of it, but at least we have a path. We know what we're working towards. And when we do that, we'll have more successes than failures. There is no doubt the opportunity for our overall region of upstate New York, let alone the Finger Lakes or Rochester or Syracuse, is bright and bountiful in terms of what we can go do. And that sort of keeps me motivated. I know that keeps the governor motivated, despite what people might say about him, and despite what some people might consider the difficulties with the general business climate and the disparity between the standards of living upstate and downstate and the needs between them. Because among all of this, the greatest challenge is not actually growing jobs and getting a regional vision. It's making sure that we're also addressing the people in our society who are most disadvantaged, who aren't getting educated, who are falling through the cracks in the various systems that they need to support themselves and to move themselves up. And that's a whole other topic. It's a whole other conversation, but truly the most important thing we're doing. So you have to balance both needs, pushing the envelope to create high-tech, next-generation jobs for the future and attract people with means to invest in your communities, but also making sure everybody's got an opportunity to participate in that. And that is incredibly challenging work. It's why I love being in government and having a job like this where we can start to impact those things directly.
Well, I appreciate you humoring me and coming in and having this discussion, because I imagine you probably feel like you're saying the same thing over and over again.
That's part of it.
But you know, it's worth talking about, because I think there are a lot of positives despite some of the negatives. So thank you for the time and coming in today.
No, it's my pleasure. I hope to come back. This is a really cool format, and I love what you're doing here.
All right, well, that is going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank our guests and our listeners, and of course, FingerLakes1.com for making this program possible. You can catch Inside the FLX on Saturdays during the 10 o'clock hour on WDWN 89.1 FM in Auburn or 97.7 FM in Fulton. The program also airs Sundays and Tuesdays on 7 p.m. on Spectrum. Channel 1304 It is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. Till next time, stay informed, Finger Lakes.